The sound you're hearing is the Chesapeake Bay in late summer. Gentle wash of tidal waters against a coastline that's still more wilderness than settlement. The air smells of salt and pine, and the particular rotten wood scent of a young colony where nothing quite works the way it is supposed to. We are at Point Comfort, the Virginia colony, in late August of 1619. A ship appears on the horizon. She's called the White Lion, Dutch in registry, but flying English colors, which tells you everything about her legal status. What merchants politely call a privateer, what everyone else knows is a pirate ship that's been hunting Spanish vessels in the Caribbean. In her hold, 20 human beings from the Kingdom of Ndongo, and what we now call Angola, are experiencing the final hours of a nightmare that began when Portuguese slavers raided their villages months ago. They don't know where they are. They don't know what's waiting for them. What they do know is that every assumption that they had about the world has been shattered. Captain John Calling Joe needs supplies. He needs fresh water, food, maybe some repairs. The Virginia colonists need labor. They are desperate for it, actually. Their tobacco fields promise wealth beyond imagination, but only if enough hands can tend to them. And indentured servants from England are not arriving fast enough to meet the demand. What follows is a transaction that seems almost mundane in its simplicity. 20 human beings exchanged for provisions. Colonist John Rolfe will record it in a letter. About the later end of August, a Dutch man of war arrived at Point Comfort. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor of Cape Merchant bought for Big 12. 20 and odd Negroes, bought for food supplies. That's it. That's the entry. The New World had known slavery for over a century at this point. Spanish and Portuguese colonies had been trafficking human beings since the 1500s. But this moment on a Virginia beach represents something different. This is the moment when what will become the United States built its foundation, not as an accident, not as an aberration, as foundation. The 20 people who step onto that beach don't know that they're first. They can't know that 246 years later, 620,000 Americans will die fighting over whether the system this moment initiates should continue to exist. This is part one of the American Civil War story, Original Sin. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. We begin our exploration of America's Civil War not with the election of 1860 or the firing on Fort Sumter, but here in 1619. You cannot understand how Americans came to kill each other by the hundreds of thousands without understanding what they were killing each other over. And what they were killing each other over was none other than the very soul of the American experiment itself. The question of whether a nation, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, could simultaneously hold millions in bondage. And so today, we'll explore how slavery became woven into American society so thoroughly that removing it nearly tore the nation apart. This is a story about the entire nation, because slavery shaped every colony, every early state, every compromise that built the American system of government, North and South, Puritan and Cavalier, founding father and enslaved person. We are going to witness how a labor shortage became a moral catastrophe, how economic opportunity became human bondage, how the men who proclaimed universal rights simultaneously created systems that denied them systematically. This is the story of America's original sin. Not because slavery was uniquely American, but because America was uniquely founded on principles that slavery utterly contradicted. Let's be clear about something from the start. Slavery didn't emerge in America because colonists were uniquely evil. It emerged because it solved a problem: how to extract wealth from vast territories with tiny populations. But the way America solved that problem created something that would poison the nation for centuries to come. Virginia in the 1620s is a collection of struggling outposts where death rates are staggering and survival is never guaranteed. Genteel plantation society of popular imagination? That comes later. Right now, this is frontier desperation, and the colonists have discovered that tobacco can make them rich. But tobacco is labor-intensive. You need hands to plant it, tend it, harvest it, cure it, pack it for shipment. Lots of hands. Initially, those hands belonged to indentured servants, mostly young white men and women who agreed to work for a fixed period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the New World. It is brutal work, but it has limits. Servants eventually become free. They can own property, participate in society, and even form families. But indentured servitude has a problem that becomes apparent by the 1640s. It is temporary. Your workers eventually become free, which means you have to replace them constantly. Worse, freed servants expect land, respect, political participation. They compete with established colonies for resources and influence. Enslaved Africans offer what economists would later call efficiency gains. They work for life. Their children work for life. They can't demand wages, land, or political rights. They represent, in the coldest of economic terms, a better return on investment than any other labor system. But here's something that makes this distinctly American. The colonies don't just adopt slavery, they innovate it. They create legal frameworks that make bondage inheritable, racial, and permanent in ways that even other slave societies found extreme. We are in Northumberland County in Virginia on July 9th of 1640. 3 runaway servants stand before a judge. Victor, a Dutchman, James Gregory, a Scotsman, and John Punch, described in the records simply as a Negro. All 3 are guilty of the same crime, attempting to flee their bondage. Victor and Gregory received sentences of 1 additional year to their master and 3 years to the colony. Then comes John Punch's turn. The said Negro, named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, here or elsewhere. That's the moment. American law transforms temporary bondage into permanent enslavement, and it does so explicitly along racial lines. 2 white men get additional terms of service. 1 black man gets a lifetime sentence for the identical crime. John Punch loses more than his freedom. He becomes a legal precedent that will justify enslaving millions. His case creates the template. White servitude is temporary, black bondage is permanent. This is arbitrary, brutal, and utterly transformative of American society. 15 years later, Elizabeth Key wins her freedom in a Virginia court, arguing that her father's English blood makes her free. But her victory terrifies the planter class. If the children of white fathers can claim freedom, if conversion to Christianity grants liberty, then slavery becomes untenable as an economic institution. So their response is swift. Virginia's 1662 law declares that children follow the conditions of their mothers, not their fathers. It doesn't matter if your father is white, free, or wealthy. If your mother is enslaved, you are enslaved. The law also specifies that conversion to Christianity doesn't alter legal status. Elizabeth Key's victory becomes slavery's legal foundation. Every loophole she's exploited gets closed. Every argument she used gets banned. Her freedom cost every enslaved person who comes after the possibility of using the same legal strategies. This is the moment when American slavery becomes a system of human breeding. Enslaved women produce labor through their own work and produce workers through their children. Slavery stops being a labor arrangement and becomes a form of livestock management. If you think slavery was confined to tobacco plantations in Virginia, you are missing half the story. Let me take you north to Massachusetts Bay, where Puritan colonists are building their city on a hill, a society they believe will serve as a moral beacon to the world. It is 1638. The ship Desire returns to Boston Harbor from the West Indies. In her hold, enslaved Africans to be sold in the Massachusetts market. The Desire is owned by some of Boston's most prominent citizens, including members of families whose names will later grace Harbor University buildings. 3 years later, Massachusetts adopts the Body of Liberties, a legal code that explicitly prohibits slavery, except for captives taken in just wars or people who sell themselves into bondage. It is a loophole large enough to drive a slave ship through, and Massachusetts merchants are happy to oblige. By 1700, 1 in 8 families in Boston owns enslaved people. They work as domestic servants, artisans, laborers in shipyards and rope walks. They build the houses, craft the furniture, load the ships that make New England merchants rich. The profits from their labor help fund Harvard College, Yale University, and countless other institutions that New Englanders proudly consider monuments to their moral superiority. Samuel Sewall embodies the contradiction. He's a Boston judge who profits from the slave trade. His account books record a thriving business in human flesh, but he also wrestles with his conscience, writing in his diary, "I am more and more uneasy about the Negroes, for I fear we are too ready to gratify ourselves with their labors and attendance, without a due regard to their spiritual welfare." Watch the mental gymnastics here. Sewall genuinely worries about the souls of the people he owns, but it never occurs to him that owning their bodies might be the real sin. He can agonize over their spiritual welfare while calculating the market value of their children. This compartmentalization will plague American Christianity for centuries. How do you reconcile owning human beings with loving your neighbor as yourself? The answer for most white Christians is to define neighbor very narrowly indeed. In 1700, the same year he publishes Selling of Joseph, one of America's first anti-slavery tracts, Sewall sits in his family pew at First Church, listening to a sermon about Christian charity. It is most certain that all men, as they are the sons of Adam and their co-heirs, and have equal rights unto liberty, he writes. The man who pens these words about universal human freedom maintains a household worked by people who cannot claim that freedom for themselves. This is something more complex and more dangerous than simple hypocrisy. It is the development of intellectual frameworks that allow people to maintain moral self-respect while participating in systematically immoral institutions. Sewell can genuinely believe in human equality while practicing human bondage, because he's learned to separate abstract principles from concrete practices. This skill, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs without distress, becomes a defining characteristic of American culture. The same society that proclaims universal rights denies them systematically. People who consider themselves moral participate in immoral systems. Most dangerously, a nation founded on liberty builds its prosperity on slavery. It is a skill that Americans will perfect over the next century and a half, and it will nearly destroy them when they can no longer avoid confronting its contradiction. But slavery doesn't just happen. It has to be constructed, legally and systematically. The legal construction of American slavery reveals a society working to solve what they see as practical problems. How do you maintain order when a significant portion of your population has every reason to rebel? How do you justify holding fellow human beings in bondage when your society proclaims Christian values? How do you prevent enslaved people from simply walking away? The solutions they developed are ingenious and they are horrifying. First, make slavery racial. Virginia's 1705 Slave Code legally defines all imported servants as slaves for life, unless they're Christian in their native land. Since most Africans brought to America aren't Christians, and since colonial authorities aren't particularly interested in religious conversion that might complicate ownership claims, this effectively makes slavery synonymous with African ancestry. But race alone isn't sufficient. The colonists also need to prevent what they most fear: alliance between enslaved Africans and poor whites against the planter elite. So they create what historian Edmund Morgan calls the American paradox. They buy white loyalty by granting political rights and social status that distinguish even the poorest white person from any black person, enslaved or free. Think about the impact. A poor white indentured servant may be beaten, overworked, and treated little better than livestock, but he knows his bondage is temporary. He possesses something no enslaved person can claim: the possibility of full membership in American society. This doesn't just prevent rebellion, it creates investment. Poor whites don't challenge the system because the system, however marginally, privileges them. They become stakeholders in slavery even when they own no enslaved people themselves. The legal framework grows more elaborate with each passing decade. South Carolina's 1740 Negro Act, passed after the Stoner Rebellion, prohibits enslaved people from growing their own food, earning money, learning to read, assembling in groups, or traveling without passes. It authorizes any white person to demand identification from any black person and to use violence to enforce compliance. But the most insidious legal innovation is the doctrine of chattel slavery. The principle that enslaved people are property in the fullest sense, to be bought, sold, mortgaged, inherited, and disposed of like any other asset. This is metaphysical revolution. It redefines the fundamental nature of personhood in American law. Consider what this means in practice. An enslaved mother has no legal relationship to her children. They belong to her owner, not to her. An enslaved husband cannot protect his wife from sexual assault by her owner. Enslaved people cannot own property, enter contracts, or testify against white people in court. They exist, legally, as extensions of their owner's will. The damage this inflicts reaches beyond enslaved people. It corrupts everyone who participates in or benefits from the system. White children grow up learning that some human beings are property. White women learn that their husbands can rape enslaved women with impunity. White men learn that absolute power over other human beings is acceptable, natural, and expected. We are now in Philadelphia, in the summer of 1787. It is the time of the Constitutional Convention. The hall is stifling. Windows are closed to prevent eavesdropping on debates that will determine the future of the American experiment. 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island has refused to participate, are trying to solve an impossible problem. How to create a more perfect union when the states they represent have fundamentally incompatible economic systems and moral philosophies. The elephant in the room? Though no one calls it that, is slavery. Everyone knows it's there. Everyone knows it threatens everything they're trying to accomplish. But no one wants to confront it directly, because confronting it directly might mean no constitution at all. By August 8th of 1787, Governor Morris stands before his fellow founders with his wooden leg, lost in a carriage accident years earlier, planted firmly as he delivers what might be the convention's most prophetic warning. Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? His voice rises with moral indignation. The inhabitants of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connection and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who view with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. The silence that follows is deafening. He's spoken the truth that everyone knows, but no one wants to acknowledge. We're creating a government that will partially be controlled by the very people who profit from human trafficking. Men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who owned hundreds of enslaved people, sit across from men like Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, who have concluded that slavery violates everything America claims to represent. They are trying to create a nation together. They can't agree on who gets to be human. 2 weeks later, Luther Martin of Maryland makes the argument more bluntly. Slavery is inconsistent with the genius of republicanism and has a tendency to destroy those principles on which it is supported, as it lessens the sense of the equal rights of mankind. He pauses, then delivers a line that will echo through American history. It is unjust to saddle posterity with such a constitution because we will not do our duty. He understands what many refuse to admit. They are not solving the slavery problem, they're passing it on to their children and grandchildren, who will inherit a nation built on contradictions. From the South Carolina delegation, Charles Pinckney rises to respond with cool certainty. South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. In every proposed extension of the powers of Congress, the state has expressly and watchfully accepted that of meddling with the importation of Negroes. Economic blackmail. South Carolina and Georgia are holding the Constitution hostage. Accept slavery, or we walk away. The compromises they reach reveal both the brilliance and the moral bankruptcy of American political culture. They're brilliant because they create a framework for union that might otherwise be impossible. They're morally bankrupt because they purchase the union at the cost of human dignity and future catastrophe. The 3/5 compromise embeds slavery into the fundamental structure of American government. The actual language reads with bureaucratic precision that masks moral absurdity. It says, representatives shall be appointed among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons 3/5 of all other persons. All other persons. They can't even say slaves in the Constitution. The euphemism reveals the discomfort with what they're legitimizing. but their discomfort doesn't prevent them from legitimizing it. Count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. It's a number that has no basis in philosophy, theology, or human experience. It's pure political calculation designed to balance competing interests. But watch what this accomplishes. Every presidential election, every apportionment of congressional seats, every decision about federal taxation will reflect the political weight of human bondage. The Constitution, then, doesn't just permit slavery, it empowers it. The Fugitive Slave Clause emerges from even less debate. Proposed by Pierce Butler of South Carolina, the language is deceptively simple. Escaped enslaved people shall be delivered up to their owners. No exceptions, no appeals, and no questions asked. This is the moment when the Constitution makes every state complicit in slavery regardless of their own laws. A free state like Massachusetts, which has abolished slavery, is constitutionally required to return escaped enslaved people to bondage. Federal law trumps state conscience. The entire nation becomes, in effect, a slave-catching territory. George Mason, himself a slaveholder, delivers perhaps the convention's most prescient warning. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites, who really enrich and strengthen a country. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. Mason understands what many refuse to admit. Slavery doesn't just oppress enslaved people, it corrupts the entire society that tolerates it. But confronting slavery directly would mean no constitution, no union, and no United States. So they chose postponement over principle, hoping that time and circumstance will somehow resolve what they cannot. The Constitution they create is then a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. The word slavery never appears in the document, but slavery is protected in multiple ways. But perhaps the most profound moment in this story comes 11 years earlier. In June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson sits in his rented room in Philadelphia, crafting the words that will justify American independence and haunt American conscience for centuries to come. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson writes these words while owning more than 200 human beings. He proclaims universal human equality while denying basic humanity to people who cook his food, build his house, and bear his children. Yes, genetic evidence now confirms that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman he owned. The compartmentalization required to maintain this contradiction reveals something profound about both Jefferson personally and the American culture generally. This is something far more complex than simple hypocrisy. It is a development of intellectual frameworks that allow people to believe sincerely in principles they systematically violate. Jefferson himself seems aware of the problem. In his original draft of the Declaration, he includes a passage condemning King George III for the slave trade, calling it piratical warfare against a distant people. But the passage is deleted at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia delegates who don't want their participation in human trafficking criticized, even indirectly. Jefferson condemns the slave trade, but not slavery itself. He blames the British for introducing human bondage to America while building his fortune on enslaved labor. He proclaims that slavery violates natural law while arguing that racial differences make emancipation impossible. This is the type of intellectual incoherence that will plague American political culture for the next 80 years. How can a nation founded on human equality tolerate human bondage? How can a republic based on consent of the governed exclude millions from governance? How can a society proclaiming Christian values systematically violate Christian principles? The attempts to resolve these contradictions reveal the extraordinary creativity of the human capacity for self-deception. Some argue that enslaved Africans aren't really humans, or at least aren't fully human, and therefore don't deserve the rights proclaimed in the Declaration. Others argue that slavery is actually beneficial to Africans, who supposedly need white guidance and control. Still, others develop what historians call the necessary evil argument. Slavery is morally wrong, but economic necessity and racial differences make immediate emancipation impossible. This becomes particularly popular among Virginia planters like Jefferson, who can maintain their moral self-respect while continuing to profit from human bondage. But perhaps the most dangerous argument is the one that acknowledges no contradiction at all. The position that slavery and freedom are complementary, that enslaving some people makes others more free. And this becomes the intellectual foundation of what will later be called the positive good argument that justifies secession and war. By 1787, American slavery has evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a system of racial bondage that's simultaneously total and profitable, permanent and expanding, legally sophisticated and morally defended. The traditional slavery of consent or debt that existed in other societies? That's not this. This is industrial slavery designed for a commercial economy that's justified by racial theory. The Constitutional Convention delegates understand they're creating a nation with contradiction at its heart, but they convince themselves that time will resolve what they cannot. Maybe slavery will gradually fade away as the economy evolves. Maybe new territories will be settled by free labor. Maybe the next generation will find solutions that escape the current one. They are wrong on all counts. Instead of fading, slavery becomes more profitable with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Instead of being confined to existing territories, slavery expands westwards with the growing nation. Instead of becoming less important to the economy, enslaved labor becomes more central as cotton becomes America's largest export. Most tragically, instead of finding moral clarity, Americans become more divided about slavery's nature and future. The revolution's promise of universal freedom creates expectations that slavery violates. Slavery's economic importance makes those expectations politically dangerous to fulfill. The result is a nation increasingly at war with itself. Every territorial expansion raises questions about slavery's future. Every economic crisis raises questions about slavery's efficiency. Every religious revival raises questions about slavery's morality. Every democratic reform raises questions about slavery's compatibility with republican government. The compromises that the founders built into the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave provision, the protection of the slave trade until 1808, do not resolve these tensions, they institutionalize them. They embed slavery so deeply into American governmental structure that removing it will require either constitutional revolution or civil war. James Madison captured the long-term implication best when he warned that the division between slave and free states created the great danger to our general government. He understood that America had created two incompatible societies under one political system, and that eventually that system would have to choose which society it wanted to be. The choice would come in 1861, and it would require the bloodiest war in American history to resolve. But the seeds of that war were planted here, in these colonial settlements, in these legal codes, in the moral compromises that made slavery not an accident of American history, but its foundation. The enslaved people whose labor built early America understood this better than anyone. In 1773, a group of enslaved men in Massachusetts petitioned the colonial legislature for freedom, writing, "We have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms without being deprived of them by our fellow men, as we are a freeborn people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever." They understood what many white Americans refused to acknowledge, that the principles of the American Revolution applied to them too, and that any nation founded on human equality would eventually have to choose between its principles and its profits. That choice would take nearly a century to arrive, and when it came, it would nearly destroy the nation that slavery had helped build. But first, Americans would spend decades trying to avoid the choice through increasingly desperate compromises, each one making the final reckoning more catastrophic when it could no longer be avoided. Next time on Double Helix, 40 years of failed compromises, from Missouri Crisis to Bleeding Kansas. We'll witness James Talmadge Jr.'s trembling hands as he proposes the amendment that splits the nation in 1819. John Brown's broadswords at Pottawatomie Creek. Preston Brooks canning Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. The desperate attempts to manage sectional conflict through geographic lines that cannot contain moral contradictions. How each compromise makes the next crisis worse, buying time while making the final reckoning more catastrophic. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.